Welcome, everybody. This is the NSDMG Revealed presentation, where we're going to talk about the 30 years of mega gaming that NSDM's been involved in. And I want to point out that we're doing this part of Connections Online with Connections and their partners, the Armchair Dragoons, to put on the convention. And with no further ado, we will start off our presentation.
Hello, my name is Van Sigling, and this is the NSDM mission statement. As you know, I will give you a chance to read this, but in a nutshell, we are trying to educate people, the attendees who play our games, without them realizing that it's an educational process. They just are going to happen to learn while playing. And with that, next. NSDM is what in the commercial field is called a live action role-playing game, or LARP. Everyone gets assigned a role, and in our case, you're part of a group. Sometimes you work to the benefit of your group, and sometimes you do not. It all depends on what task you have been given. We represent usually nations, but not always. And the play focuses a lot on the actions and initiatives taken by the players once we, the staff, start throwing problems at them. Next. Normally, our standard games, the ones that we are ready to play at not too much notice, are contemporary 1960s Cold War with an emphasis on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then for our science fiction and fantasy conventions, near future and sci-fi doomsday games. We have discovered that the science fiction people have quite a, shall I say, inventive idea as to how games and situations can be handled. We are also developing other games at any and every given time. We have some what we call experimental games, which we can modify to fit the needs, say, of an educational activity. Next. When we attend a convention, be it a gaming convention, a science fiction convention, or we are teaching at a college or university, we have the ability to give seminars and panel discussions. We also run the NSDM games. The NSDM games, see, the mega game, which is a very long game with Merle's favorite economics thrown in, we have not done too many of them recently, but we are capable of putting them in if someone asked us to. Right now, we're doing mostly fast play games, and crisis games, and the doomsday games. The fast play tend to be about 1 hour of preparation and explanation, and then 3 hours or so of play. The crisis games are exactly that, And the doomsday game is quite simply a fun brawl with people assigned to different countries, but there is absolutely no reason as far as who shoots at who. Next. We are a nonprofit educational, recently incorporated corporation. So these are the things we try to do. Most of us have a background in government or are very well read. We have the usual disclaimer. All the opinions, errors, and omissions you see are not those of our past, present, or future employers. That's our story, and we are sticking to it. As far as who we are, Mark McDonough, who is waving, is a retired naval captain, sub officer. He is, with his brother Dan, were the co-founders of NSDM. See, that was Naval War College. Okay. Merle Robinson, who introduced us, is currently the Secretary Treasurer of NSDM. Robert Mosier is retired Foreign Service. He's here. And with a lot of experience helping with war games in other departments besides State Department. Back one, please. I'm Van Sigling. I'm the Vice President of NSDM, and my primary job is trying to keep Merle Robinson on task and not adding too much workload to everyone else. And we have 20 other volunteers or so. We are constantly recruiting. Next. This is Mark's.
Yeah, I guess this is mine. This is where we've been. We generally have been doing the civilian war game conventions, Gen Con and Dragoncon are our staples. We enjoy going to academic.
Mark, your volume's way down.
Oh, okay. We enjoy going to academic institutions. I'll just try to speak louder. I don't have it set up right now. But we don't get invited much. We've been to Campbellsville University. We've been at Ashland. We've been at Ball State University, and a couple other demonstration games for government activities. But we're always looking to expand on that. But right now, the only people who are routinely going to be bringing us in are the civilian war game conventions, and we enjoy those. And they treat us for anything from very well to very poorly. Next slide. Okay. We're on social media. We used to have a website, but it's a matter of how few of us there are and whether or not we're spending our time making our game better or spending our time trying to keep our website up. So our website's fallen into some form of disrepair, but our Facebook page is active. We post a lot of things of interest there on a national security, global geopolitics interest level. So I suggest if you want to keep up with us, go to our Facebook page. We'll also tell you where our next events are going to be. We also have a channel on YouTube where we have posted lectures and seminar panels we've given at Gen Con and Dragoncon last year, and we'll be continuing to add to that as well. Next slide. Okay, as far as where we stand, my brother Dan McDonough, on staff at Naval War College, started NSDM in 1990. The Naval War College was contacted then by people who were working Origins, the Origin Convention, along with the other services, to ask if we could come and give lectures about professional wargaming at the war colleges. Dan at that point offered also to put on a demonstration game to try to demonstrate how these various NSDM is going, the government conducts war games and what the use of those war games is. Continue, please. Next slide. Okay, we started in 1990. Can you hear me now? Am I still too quiet?
You're still a little low.
Okay, I'll try to get this really close. But anyway, we started in 1990. At that point, the Origins Convention was the national war game convention. It was moving from city to city, piggybacking onto another major convention. And it's a useful symbiotic relationship with both of them. But Origins at that point was a Dragoncon in Atlanta. And we put on National Security Decision-Making Game the first day in Dragoncon. And plus, my brother Dan started to give lectures. He was wildly popular. He was mostly telling sea stories. Those of you who knew my brother Dan knew he was a very outgoing speaker and he was very entertaining. So by word of mouth, his audiences got larger and larger, and I just ran food back and forth to him to make sure he didn't collapse. And we're asked to put on, the game was popular, we asked to put on a second game at the same time on the third day of the convention. So we did that, and at that point, that was the beginning of it. So next slide. Yeah, so the Dragoncon 1990 game book. I remember Dan holding this up, saying, "Holy cow! I didn't see that in the budget." But at any rate, it was one of the largest game conventions back then. And continue, please. Next slide. Okay, but at that point, we started to continue with Gen Con and Origins as Origins moved from one site to another. Dan started
Mark,
1990. Yes.
we really need you to work on your sound. Take a minute, because people absolutely cannot hear you on some of the YouTube stuff. So see if you can mess with your mic and get better volume. You getting any difference? We just lost your sound altogether. I'll tell you what, let's shift for a couple of slides and have Robert fill in on a couple of them and let you mess with that for a minute. So Robert, can you pick up? Or you want
You got
me?
me? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so Merle is actually a lot more experienced on the marketing side. He's taught the rest of us a lot about how we do this now, but you can see how we've worked in the past. Emphasis has been a long time on posters. We've expanded into the website, on Facebook through our actions at the activities of the Connections conferences, T-shirts, mugs. You can see all of that, regular player emails. Basically trying to keep in touch with people who've played NSDM and want to play it again, and people who want to find out what NSDM is all about. Next. You can see some of the works that we've done, especially at conventions. Our old mascot there in the corner with the pointer. I guess we have to upgrade him and give him a PowerPoint Ranger badge and a laser pointer in the next iteration, Merle.
Good
Next.
plan.
And we've collected pictures of some of the staff and players at previous conventions. 1997 at Origins, 1998, the NSDM staff. It's all before my time. I was overseas at this point. Next. And Dragoncon and Origins in 2014. There's some interesting reflection here. If you look closely at the pictures, you see the change in the player population over the years. And a little bit of change in the staff population, although in some of these you can't tell who's who, which is one of the issues we always have to work with, and why Van is showing the NSDM shirt proudly. Next.
Testing 1, 2.
That's better, Mark. I'll tell you what, see how you do on this one. We'll see if your volume's good enough. Mark? We had good volume here a second.
Mark, over to you.
Okay, so we'll drive on. We're still having that problem. So this is a picture of Dragoncon 2019. Just to give you a sense of how the crowds change from site to site. I'm going to give Mark another shot. Hey, Mark, how's your sound? Mark, I'm not even seeing motion. It's like he's lost his connection or he's got a bad internet connection. It's okay. Basically, our background was from the Naval War College, because that's where both Dan and Mark had been serving. Dan was an instructor when NSDM began, and Mark was in the wargaming department. Oh, I think we got sound, Mark. You want to pick up? Testing. I'm hearing good sounds from your side. Speak, please. Mark?
Testing 1, 2.
That's excellent. You can pick up. Hearing you 4x4. Mark, can you pick up at this slide? Okay, I guess not. So as the two brothers were both dealing with wargaming at the Naval War College, and when they were invited to Dragoncon in 1990, this is the kind of mindset we started with, where basically we were doing professional modeling.
Testing 1, 2.
Yes, Mark, I'm hearing you.
Okay, I can. Yeah, I have to use one system to hear and one system to speak.
Well, fair enough.
I tested them both out before an hour ago, but now, okay, whatever.
Fair enough.
This is your slide to speak to anyway, I think, Merle.
Oh, okay. Well, this is basically our background. We started with that Naval War College approach and the professional concept of how you model, how you war game, and how you build your tools and aids. So this is basically the core structure of our game. Players represent their cones of supporters and pursue their goals. Mark, do you want to pick up or you want me to keep going?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll continue. Yes, with the whole our challenge here is to represent hundreds of thousands or millions of people in a nation and their body politic and how those all work together. And we do that with 12, 15, 20 players. Now, in our game, players we're assigning players roles. This is your agenda. This is what you want to accomplish. Often there are positions that they could fight over. Appointments. You want to become general secretary. You want to become minister of culture. You want to become the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Those are movable. They shift around, and who you are, what you're fighting for, it does not change when you take on different positions, but they give you additional responsibilities, authorities, abilities to carry out your agenda. Now, these people are representing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in their cone, and they're the person who has risen to the top of that cone is making decisions, taking actions for that. In general, in our game, we don't allow people to assassinate other people. We take a player out of the game. That player, at these civilian conventions, that player is paid money to come and play our game, and he wants an enjoyable experience. And the other thing is, if, for example, someone were to assassinate the Secretary of State, we're not going to pick some hippie to be Secretary of State. We're going to be picking someone else out of that cone of State Department officers who knows the things and is usually going to be following the administration policy very closely. So if someone is assassinated, we say, okay, he's assassinated, but we just replace him with someone who looks, sounds, and talks just like him. So we put the player back and make a note on whatever board that's saying, yeah, you got assassinated once and now you're back in, which might be a point in his favor, might be a point against him. But that's how we handle that. As far as the fixed roles, someone might come in saying he's a social, ethnic, political, or economic group, military factions. Those are created in order to stimulate the internal tensions, pushes, and shoves, how a nation's going to be moving, who's going to be moving it in what direction, and who's going to win and who's going to lose, and who's going to decide how to cooperate with someone else, where the points are for compromise, and how decisions are being made. Next. Now, this is what NSDM is about. We're trying to determine what the influences are. Who are the people? What are the properties? What are the various institutions? How is security is determined? What is the economy? We had developed this originally from the games that we would play for a week or two at the Naval War College. Only our challenge was first to make it run in 8 hours. And then when I think the general body, the politic of the country got less and less focused, or our attention span grew shorter, we had to run it in 4 hours. And now we're being told, you need to cut your game down to 2 hours. So increasingly, we're trying to cut various portions of our game down to 2 hours. But our game is a seminar. We're going to be generally a bunch of guys sitting around a table, guys and gals, discussing their issues. They have their agenda, each of them, their motivation, how they want to move the nation's policies, and how they want to spend the nation's money. And in that, they're taking on or it's a live action role playing in a way, they're taking on the role of that cone and that set of people. Externally, we are the game control group. We facilitate and we provide adjudications as to what happened. We also insert external stimuli to try to keep the game moving in certain directions. Next slide. Is this one mine? I think that's proper.
Yep. So NSDM is basically, it's about relationships. It is the relationships not just between people, it's the relationships between nations, between factions, political parties, and individuals within each nation, and the relationship of all of these moving parts with the issues and challenges and events that fall into what are generally called national security decision-making realm. They can be domestic issues, they can be international issues, they can be interplanetary issues. It all depends upon the game, the scenario, the time, place, and the audience for which we're running the game. As the slide lays out, a lot of the issues presented to the players also relate to money, which, as we all know, is one way of keeping score of what's going on in a game. Next. So you see the spectrum of relationships. We capture, we look at a country and we look at what are the different playing groups, playing individuals, factions, how do they relate to each other, which ones are the most significant in making decisions about the future of the country, about what policies the country will adopt, how well they're implemented or not. We rank order them in various ways in order to determine how many players would we actually need in the game to represent this country cell, and how many players could a cell support beyond the minimum requirement. Next. Players are, what we're trying to do is replicate, actually represent, not replicate what's going on in the country. A player has possibly a political party identification, a faction identification, cultural, social, political, population. They are placed within the organizational structures of the country. They could be they could be a government minister, they could be a labor leader, they could be a businessman, whoever the key players are within that country that we've identified and put into play in the cell. We then look at how do they implement policy, how do they proceed to get a decision accepted and then acted upon by the cell. And again, that goes back to how do we represent how it's actually done in the country to give the players the feel for the decision-making process in that particular nation. Next. So what we're trying to get to is how the realpolitik, how the politics actually works on the ground in that country. Do they emphasize personal relationships? Do they emphasize ethnic relationships? And then we use the relationships as the players act out those different roles, and we try and simulate logical, and logical in this sense is logical within the context we've presented the players. Human beings reason, they don't always act logically. We try and give the different factors that the players have to deal with, as you see laid out. One of the things we try and remember, especially when we're dealing with a hobby audience, is that it's supposed to be an enjoyable and educational experience. Depending on the venue and the audience and what their objective is, what they want us to achieve with the game, we emphasize along the spectrum of fun at one end and education at the other. We'd like to be somewhere closer to the middle most of the time. Next. So the things that we can do within with the NSDM tools, the people that we've got, versus the things that we know we can't do. You see what we do well. You can see the approach, a lot of education, a lot of research, and 30 years of experience of running the games have taught us a lot about how to put on these games, how to design the mechanics, how to make the mechanics work. What we do poorly, in honesty, you have to face the reality that you cannot take an average resident of the United States today and make them feel, think, act like someone from China, someone from Iran, someone from Germany, or even someone from England. There's so many different cultural, educational, class, political factors working that we can give the player the best information we can and hope that we can approximate for them the experience of living and working within that country cell and get the cell to produce realistic results when it's in play. Next.
So we have a question. And the question is basically, reacting to the past games have some issues with historical views and speeches in the classroom, particularly 19th century US. How does NSDM deal with more current differences? And I'll start that one and let you guys chime in. Basically, what we try to do, and we'll show some examples in a little bit, is we try to analyze what's going on in the country, and whether it's political parties or non-state actors or NGOs that are the important components, and try to talk about what their real capabilities and abilities are and what their level of influence is. So the big thing that we try to do is figure out what the attributes and vectors of decision making are, because our focus is on how they make decisions. The learning process we're trying to enhance is that people can understand how other folks' point of view and circumstance affects those decisions. So you guys want to elaborate on that?
You have situations where you might have a Sunni Arab talking to a Shiite Arab, and they normally don't talk to each other, really.
Yeah, we try to steer a middle ground through the current body politic. Current right now, I see a lot of polarization in the United States, especially. And last few years, we've tried to stay away from even running the U.S. For fear that there are going to be fistfights. We don't want to try to take a stand on one side versus the other. If nothing else, it will be at each other's throats as we have a widely spread ideological diversity within the team itself. I think that's a strength. We get along, we respect each other, but we don't want to try to say that one side's right, one side's wrong. We're happy to say one side's right, one side's wrong if we're talking about Iran or China, where usually the U.S. can come to a consensus. In terms of current problems in the U.S., we're trying to stay away from that because we don't want to antagonize people. We're putting the game on for education, entertainment purposes, not to try to, as Merle was saying, to try to study how decisions are made, not how to study if we are currently making the right decisions or the wrong ones in the United States.
Yeah, the other thing I would point out is one of the things that's a core principle for us is to try to be as apolitical as we can in our analysis. It's not so much who's going to win or who's right. It's what's the dynamics of that nation and its relations with other nations that are a component. So when we brief the game to the players, one of the things we really stress is your worst enemy may not be somebody in the next country. It could be a guy in the next seat. It could be that industrialist that's sitting next to you who's totally opposed to your political plans as a senator or a legislator from some country.
We have had many times when the leader of a country, the president, prime minister, dictator, whatever, has discovered that the person that he had to worry the most about was the media guy sitting next to him.
Okay. So as is consistent with a lot of games, NSDM games come with a story arc. In preparing a game for a venue, whether the host wants us to introduce particular countries into the game, or we look at current events or the time frame if we're doing a Cold War game, what countries are going to provide the most interesting play for the players, focus on the educational goals, and then we will construct a series of narrative arcs, a series of events that will impact on one or more of the countries that are in play, either directly or indirectly. And then the interaction of the players with those story arcs generates more story arcs where we think it supports the overall objective we're steering the game towards, or we want to see the players play towards. And then we adjudicate the players' actions. We also try to manage the injection of events and results through the game in order to control the game pace. As a lot of you will know, especially when you're dealing with a player audience that perhaps hasn't played the game before, there's a slow build up until people get engrossed in the game and they understand how to play. Pace picks up. And there used to be when the founder Dan McDonough talked about NSDM to a newer audience, he always included the classic ending often happening for an NSDM game, especially at a hobby convention, which was the United States would go around the room and start looking at other country cells and poking them to try and get a response. And I've noted that in my experience of gaming, both for the government and in private, that both NSDM and a lot of DoD State Department exercises both declare index with a nuclear mushroom cloud. So next. So as with a lot of the DoD people will be familiar with the measles master scenario inject list, the library of events that we've created before the game, and we've laid out along a timeline with a plan. At least we should have this event occur at this point during the game. These are, as we said, used to stimulate play, add flavor to the game, and keep the players active, keep them moving, interacting with each other. We try and keep the players engaged in the game. We try and identify players who need assistance or encouragement to engage in the game. Every once in a while, we identify a player who we maybe need to have quit bouncing off the walls as much and try and maybe get them to focus on something in particular that might slow them down a little bit and allow the rest of the players to physically and emotionally catch up with them. Next. So balance. NSDM in particular, we've talked about how we try and balance the emphasis in the game and a particular game design between education and fun, depending on who our audience is, what the issues are we're dealing with. In the design process, there are constraints and balances. We have to balance the fact that we are mostly a body of volunteers working for no pay, trying to draw upon our educational and training experience to give the players a realistic experience, whether we're creating a new country sale or whether we're designing a new game. And the balance of trying to keep the game playable within the times that we're allotted, whether it's by an academic host, the government host, or a convention host, a convention venue. So we need to keep the game playable versus beneficial, educational, and informative, and realistic. You see the whole series of issues we're dealing with. And of course, perhaps relating to some of the things we've just discussed in response to questions, you have the problem of garbage in, garbage out. We try and keep NSDM fact-based. And the more we move away from fact basis, the less comfortable we are that we're giving the player audience a valuable product. And sometimes that means that our idea to do a country sell has to be put off until we can feel that we've got more facts assembled and a better understanding to produce that sell. Next.
The other thing I want to be sure we add here, because you brought up that subject, is when we look at story arcs in our game, we normally start with a theme. So, for example, if the theme is, the potential rise of water levels in the world, and Crimea is an island, or whether it's a new technology, and we tend to have one big theme like that, where we have a series of injects and events that will pique the player's curiosity and/or imagination. And then in the course of play, because we've done this a lot, we have smaller sub-threads that we'll add as something interesting. So if the players are moving slowly and we've got a DPRK cell running in play, we may have something about DPRK smugglers being captured, and then both sides have something to work on. So the thing to understand, though, that's really essential, and we'll foot stomp this a couple of times, is the players are really in charge. We have these events, and some of them are things they might have little impact on, but they can pretty much impact and change the narrative for anything in our games. And that's one of the reasons why we have a very a rabid following.
And I think to add one other point to what Merle just added very usefully, we try to never present the player audience in any setting with a problem, a challenge, or an issue that in fact is really something they can do nothing about. So, I mean, we don't tell them that the planet killer is like 3 minutes out. Okay, you've moved up slides on me, but let's see. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, one of the things about timescale within NSDM that seems to place us in a pretty unique end of the gaming spectrum, the gaming world. The movement of time forward during the play of the game is actually player-driven and event-driven. We don't start a clock at the beginning of the game and have it tick, 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 tick through the game. We stretch time, we compress time, we leap forward, we freeze time. It all depends upon what we need to do to make it possible for the players to keep playing through the issues, the challenges, and the decisions that they're trying to make in response to the issues that we've put in front of them. For example, we exaggerate R&D. And I was thinking as we were preparing the presentation that it's almost as if we give the United States and other countries the U.S. World War II ability to turn on a dime and rapidly produce major defense systems, regardless of complexity. Players try to put innovative technology into the game, and we compress the time that's actually in real world because we want them to see the results of their decision actually reflected in the play of the game as we continue forward.
And if nothing else, in a civilian environment, we need to reward them. We can't tell a player that he needs to build another carrier battle group and then not allow him to do that because it takes too long in the game time.
Yeah, exactly.
So the other thing I'd foot stomp here is there are some unique things we do with time, and Robert sort of alluded to it, but this seems to be one of the key differences between what we can do with a non-contract game compared to some of our peers. So, for example, we did a demo for the faculty at National Defense University, and they had required that we have 2 NATO nations involved in play. One was France and the other was Turkey, because those were the countries we had prepped and done research on. And we had to give them a problem they could work on in common. So part of the storyline was that they had a crisis in Lebanon. They already had UN peacekeepers there, which in that period would have not been unreasonable. But we also knew that when the locals besieged their little outpost, that the Turkish players, because of the nature of that country's structure, were going to decide pretty quickly. But the French wanted to debate it in their legislature. So for purposes of the game, we let them both do those things. And we started controlling the contact between the cells, so that essentially they wound up 6 months out of sync in real world for them to both experience that part of the process, because there were enough things we could do until we got to a stumbling block where the Turks wanted to do something that would directly impact what the French were doing. We were able to keep them separate, and they didn't realize it until after the game. The other thing is, at times, one of the examples Dan used to love to talk about is we'd slow down the game and have an event where everybody would sort of gather around, and we'd talk about the guys jumping up the mountain in Norway to put the signal tower up, just long enough to add that tension and excitement. Then we go right back to the super high level where it's like, oh, well, you got a trade pact you're trying to negotiate with somebody.
Yeah. So next. So this reflects as well what we talked about earlier about when you set up a cell, a nation cell, you go with an A level manning, a B level manning, C level manning, and so on. And that goes back to the A level represents what's the fewest number of players and positions that I need filled for this cell to work and contribute to the game. B represents an augmentation of number of players in the cell that gives us the opportunity to include more players and also to broaden the range of issues that the cell can address. And then C is the maximum number, and this gets to often hobby convention games where we're trying to include as many player participants as possible, and it really brings us the full range of issues that country cell and the other country cells that it's interacting with can address. even into the esoteric issues of trade, crop management, agriculture, a whole range of issues that really seem to be marginal out of the classic thinking of national security decision making, which everyone focuses on arms, armaments, peace treaties, disarmament, and territorial claims. So it's a very much more interesting game. Now, the issue then becomes when you start going to B and C level positions, you have to ask the question as you're designing the cell is by incorporating this player position in the cell, what is there that they can actually do in the game with the issue portfolio that we've given them that will allow them to get them to engage with other players? Or is this going to be a player position that everybody else is going to ignore because we don't really care what you do with crop management in the Southern Delta because we're busy building nuclear weapons big enough to blow up the asteroid that's coming. You got to keep in context the whole storyline of the game you're using and the issues that are in play and the players. It's really depressing to give a player something that nobody wants to have anything to do with them about because it's not interesting.
Another good example of that in play is many years ago when we first designed the French cell was when Sarkozy was running for office. And we had a Muslim party that actually was publicly active with large numbers that was supporting Sarkozy. And what we found is that shortly after that election in real life, there were a number of the leadership in that party that were connected to Islamic terrorists. So the little party basically dissolved. But we've sort of kept a vestige of that in our games, even up to the current day, to talk about the moderate Muslims and give that player who's playing that faction a choice. And when we talk about the true extremists on one side or the other, those tend to be managed by the facilitators or our stealth control staff. And we'll talk more about that in a bit.
Merle, would you please talk about the poor little girl who drew the terrorist job?
Okay. So the other thing that we have happened to us, because we do games at hobby conventions where the general public can walk in, often gamers bring their kids. Fortunately, for the most part, they don't bring their kids for us to be daycare. They come and play with the kids, either as a separate role or just to coach the kids. But like every once in a while, we find one that, somebody needs a challenge. So we had a guy bring his, I think she was 9 years old, daughter along, and she was having a real problem in a normal role. And we realized that was a problem. We saw her struggling, and her dad didn't have quite the level of time that she needed. Yeah. So we assigned a facilitator to work with her, and we made her Chechen terrorists. And by the end of the game, everybody was afraid of this little girl because she had one event after another. She was bombing Orthodox churches. She was doing all these little stuff, none of which disrupted the overall flow of the game. But every time she did something, she jumped up and down in glee, and all the players around cheered. So sometimes it's really useful. Another example of how we adapt is we go to Dragoncon and people come in costumes. So one year a guy came in dressed as a pirate, and he had a stuffed monkey on his shoulder. And normally we have a facilitator run the constitutional court in Turkey, which in some of our early versions of the cell was an actual player. So we made the monkey the constitutional court. So whenever something went on, the facilitator went up behind the monkey and voiced the role, and everybody got a big kick out of it because it's supposed to be fun.
Okay, next. So the other issue about relationships is when you're trying to put a game together, again, as Merle has noted, when we work with a government agency or an academic institution, they often request specific country relationships to be represented in the game. For a hobby convention audience or for some academic institutions, we've proposed countries that be involved. And there is no limit in the sense of which countries are interesting. There's no limit reflecting size, reflecting power. They don't even have to be physically adjacent on the globe. What we're looking for is countries that are linked by relationships, by issues, by interests, by ancient resentments. Anything that would have those two countries interact, even if they don't have a common border. Now, obviously, in the Cold War, the grandest case was the United States and the Soviet Union didn't specifically have a common land border, and for the most part, required technical means to see each other. So that was kind of the master case. But when you start reaching into other countries and other parts of the world, sometimes it's not the most interesting set. Like France and Spain don't necessarily make a very promising game. France and Germany offers a little bit more interest. France and Poland might offer some interest. You need to have the links. The links do not need to be physical. That would make the countries involved in the game of interest. Next. Okay.
Okay, so this one's mine.
Yep.
Basically, what we wanted to give you a picture of is how we set up our games. Basically, regardless of the physical setup, we basically set up a game director, which often is me, and that game director's job is to control the pace of the game. If the players aren't busy enough, we give them more to do by injecting events. If they're self-entertaining and they're plenty busy, we're going to slow it down because the object is not to overwhelm the players. It's to give them opportunities to make decisions and interact. So essentially the way we set up is each nation is a country cell, and we call them cells for a very distinct reason. They're not teams. At least in anything except our experimental games, the guy that could be your buddy or your enemy sits next to you, not just in the other country. Each one of those cells normally has a controller in to direct the internal processes of that nation. So if they have votes in elections or phony elections, they're the person that you go to help adjudicate how that works. If we're in a very large environment, sometimes we'll have a deputy controller to help with some of the paperwork. We'd like to run as many cells as we can manage at an event because it's the interaction between nations that often leads to the most exciting play. Then over on the side, we've got the staff structure. We normally have a series of facilitators in the side of the room that represent all the rest of the world. And we basically tell the players, if you want to go talk to the controller that's for France, because France is not being played as a player nation, he can talk to you as the terrorists or the police, and if he hasn't got a way to know, he won't tell himself about your terror attack. Then we have a military controller so that military units are only in one place at any one time, and we'll show you how that works a little more in a minute. And we basically project a military events map with the public things so people can visually see what's going on. And you'll see an example of how we did that in the early days and what we've advanced to now in a little bit. And then we have thread control and news feed. We normally have at least 2 projection screens up in our rooms now. One will show the military map and the other will show a news feed. And that's helped us tremendously because what we used to do is you had to have somebody walk from cell to cell or empower a player to be, NBC News, and they'd be shouting over all the other activity. So what's funny now is we now have people very geared to watching the news feed because both general news and specific agreements or decisions made between the nations and sometimes comedic news shows up on the feed. So to give you an example of where we have fun with the players, when they had a nuclear release from a sunken submarine off of Japan, very shortly after in one game, a freighter pulled up into a Japanese port with a bunch of guys that when they were at the bar were drunk and talking about this huge thing that came and got them. And there were huge gashes down the side of the thing. And the players were going, they didn't. No, they really didn't, did they? And eventually they find out it's a promo for the next Godzilla movie. But the thing is, we have fun with them, and that's important too. So
the other thing that can happen, since I'm the guy who often does the news feed, if someone gives me a whole bunch of written gibberish that I cannot figure out, I will print the gibberish and modify it and make it exciting. And I know the one time we had the Russian foreign minister who got so drunk his people, I had his staff haul him off to his hotel room because he was coming up with all sorts of wacky ideas. Like, yes. Why can't we get along?
Yes. So one of our audience asked, is there anything published about this? And the answer is not really. And part of the reason for that is for most of our stuff, it's so dynamic. We have had a limited series of discussions about our Cold War packs because the Cold War only changes based on new research. But the nasty thing about this is we build a country cell based on a hypothesis and the theories about how it runs, and then they do wild things like have elections or their own coups and stuff, and that creates a whole series of challenges in keeping it up to date. If somebody wanted to come on board and help us do that commercially, I think it would be great, but the product that's most viable is our Cold War product. So in terms of how we structure the game for staff, basically we have the overall director, which handles the pace of the game and tries to ensure that people are having fun. That role is to see if there's somebody standing in a corner all by themselves, or who's got no traction, or who's lost every election in their country and has run out of ideas. That's that person's job, to go over and sort of prod them and help them and coach them. We have military and economic controllers. Often we don't do a lot with economics in the short games, but we do use controllers for both, and that's to see that there's only one version of the truth for the players. We have our facilitators that represent the rest of the world, and we try to see that there are enough facilitators. Those are normally staffers, but sometimes we will take veterans out of the crowd and say, would you like to do this and see behind the curtain? And they oblige. And basically our role for facilitators is to generally react to the players unless there was a pre-planned inject for you to do. So if you have a facilitator, Iran, it may be his job to shoot something up in the Straits of Hormuz, but he's not there to start a war with America. He's to let them figure out what they're going to do about it and react as we believe the Iranians would react, not drive the players to solution. And then we have the cell controllers that do the national processes and administer national activities. And when we do PMBs, those are normally managed by the cell controllers with some help. And of course, there's those players that are what make the whole game happen. So the structure of play normally is such that we have an in brief that talks about mechanics in the background of the world. So we'll tell them if we changed a basic fact. So if the basic fact is there's an ongoing war between China and Taiwan, now what are you guys going to do about it? That's in the in brief. If it's, the water levels all increased in Crimea as an island, that's in the in brief. And we try to have some major thing, maybe not as dramatic as those, for the players to deal with. And then we assign positions. We used to assign those where people could sort of trade off. Now, because of time limitations, we basically hand them out at random, and it's very rare that we've had a real problem with that. But if we do, we can deal with it. We also do a veteran warning. We have had people who have played 60 NSDM games that still come and play NSDM again and again. So we try to tell people who have learned how we run mechanics, who tend to read the news more, and who tend to read more history books, so that they're the ones that you should watch out for, because they could be your best friend or your worst enemy. And then we give them specific briefings in their country cells about their country. Particularly for the Cold War, that's valuable with youngsters, because you have to talk about the whole mentality of communism, the issues between the United States and Soviet Union, or the United States and China. We have to talk about the mechanics for how they have votes or elections or pass legislation. And basically, we give them some time to learn who's who. So the first 20 to 30 minutes of any 4-hour game is doing that portion that you see us start. And then we release them into the wild, and they interact with one another and interact with the staff, and they'll come up with ideas. And we'll talk about how we manage those in a little bit. But essentially, if they say, I want to build an interstate highway system, the staff says, to do that, you need this kind of support or this kind of funding. In our game, small projects can be free, but big projects always have something you should be trading off for. And if our individual facilitator is uncertain, they come to the senior staff and ask for an opinion. And at the end, we used to have promotional items, which we sort of abandoned because they carry weight and slow us down getting in and out of the events. But we would hawk our merchandise. We would do a debrief, which is the biggest thing, which we call the excuse generation phase, or the mutual recrimination phase, or the what on your earth were you thinking phase, because you'll find out why people did that wacky thing. And many times there are unnatural and unnerving consequences to what players choose to do. All of the stuff that generates the game's results are things like this: the cells' actions, other cells' actions, individuals that do things. We've had games where people became real organ leggers, like from the Larry Niven novels, and sold people for body parts. How all this stuff comes together. Okay, and basically the core of the game has to do with decisions and with a way of negotiating and asking intelligently between players. Weird things happen in our games, and that's okay. We had a contemporary game not that long ago where the Japanese wanted to get rid of radioactive soil from Fukushima. They had a Chinese cleanup company, and guess what? They built more land on the islands that are contested in the South China Sea. Makes perfect sense. Okay. And the whole thing is basically about helping players get synthetic experience about how to make decisions with role play. You know, we're all about involving them, seeing they have player agency and choice. But the thing that makes NSDM very different and very similar to this new trend of mega games, it's a psychological ownership, a joint narrative, and it's very visceral. They always remember what happened in an NSDM game. If you ask somebody who played, almost always they will go on a rant about the cool thing they were involved in. And the audience differences impact the insights and takeaway. One of the things we have to deal with as we manage a game has to do with age cohorts. You know, if you have people who are all 20-somethings, they don't remember 9/11 as a real event. Where people who are 40 years old, that can be very critical. That affects their play. And the guidelines we use for play are pretty straightforward, and I'm going to pass that to Robert.
So as you see laid out here, and as you can tell from the way we've been briefing the game, the players arrive to play the game. We tell them these are the countries that are in play. We lay out the world as it is at this point as play begins. And then we launch the players into the game to address the issues we've already identified and then have them respond to new injects as the gameplay proceeds. And then the staff, whether facilitator, military controller, whatever the role, then responds to the actions and decisions of the players, either telling them this is how it's going to play out, or, you know, in the role of staff, okay, you've asked us for information about the reported nuclear blast. We'll put the agencies on this, and you come back in a certain period of time, and we'll give you the briefing product as a result of what we find. The emphasis is the staff reacts to play. Other than the continuous injects that we've pre-scripted before the game, we try and just keep out of the player's way, except to steer them into the game to keep them from flying completely off out of control. Although there was one game in which the players were moving forward at such a rapid pace with such enthusiasm and not unreasonably. It was like the staff just backed up against the wall and watched, and then, you know, anybody needed to be nudged back into the mob, we just gently pushed them back in. We try and deal with it.
We had the one time when North Korea actually launched nuclear weapons against the South. And within, I think, about 15 minutes, the United States, Russia, and China all turned North Korea into a radioactive wasteland.
And sometimes we have to get really creative there. For example, we had one game where the North Koreans were in play, and every 5 minutes they did the 5-minute hate about South Korea and how they were going to come for them. And when they finally launched their offensive, everybody knew they were coming. So halfway through an 8-hour game, they destroyed North Korea. So we gave them a lunch break, and when they came back, we made them the U.S. Congress, and they had to fix it. You know, another example, and this was one where honestly it sort of got away from us because it happened so fast. We had a game where the scenario was that Kim died, and his 3-year-old child had a regency established. So the Chinese call up North Korea and say, you got all those nukes under control, right? You know where they all are. And they wind up talking to a grandfatherly character who says he's regent on the phone. He says, well, certainly we do. And the Chinese didn't believe it. So the Chinese defense minister basically log rolled an invasion of North Korea in 15 minutes in a 6-hour game without considering any of the ramifications, because his first reaction was go lobby for everybody to say yes. And he didn't ask about the military situation at all, what the pros and cons were, what the ramifications were. He didn't go to the military controller for it. And the staff didn't grab him and physically take him aside and say, wait, think about what you're going to do. Are you sure? and they log rolled into North Korea. It was wild. So we had an entire cell disappear and had to figure out, what are we going to do with those people? Because we want them to still be able to play and not have to walk out halfway through the game.
This brings up, too, a couple of these scenarios. As we brief the players in the in-brief, the facilitators are your staff. So when the Premier of China turns to the People's Liberation Army and says, how quickly can you get control of the North Korean nukes? The facilitators, as the Chinese army, go, 30 minutes or it's free, Mr. Chairman. So, we remind them, we will respond to you as your staff within the situation that we've given you, whatever country you're in. In many countries, this means we can be very professional, very on the ball. We can reflect the varied resources that different governments have available to them. But in those states where there's a lot of emphasis on obedience and following orders and never upsetting the leadership, that's the response you're going to get from the staff.
Yes, oh great Saddam, we will give the Americans the mother of all battles. It will be over soon.
Yeah, we shall win by Christmas. We just don't tell you which Christmas.
Exactly.
So as we've talked about before about adjudication, in the context of game adjudication, one of the important things about NSDM is we are doing adjudication on the fly. We do not want to pause the game as we play to rule on the results of each player's action and decision. We will reflect upon what they've proposed to do on their plan, on the resources they have available, on the requirement, and whether they've met it of political acquiescence from other players, other cells. And we will try and keep it reasonably realistic within the scenario that we're playing. The reminder always of trying not to say no to the players, but either to steer the players in a realistic direction, or if they continue to pursue an unrealistic action, we give them the consequences. You see our man with the unintended consequences. It's practically an NSDM mantra. It's a great plan, except for. I see. Was that Merle? Did you pop that question up?
It's not a question, it's a statement.
Oh,
so what
okay.
lets us do that on the fly is the experience of the team.
And when necessary, the team members putting their heads together and going, okay, my piece of the answer to this is X. Mark might come in and give us the military element of the response. Merle, both the game management, scenario development, and having often planned the scenario out within the context of our game design here, this is how we work this out. And again, as I said, on the fly, quick moving, turn it around, and get the players into the game again. So, as we've noted a couple of times, NSDM tries to focus, tries to design whatever we present to the playing audience to fit the context that they're in, whether it's an academic, advanced curriculum. Are we trying to meet a need within your curriculum to further do a deep dive into some issue or some part of the world? How much time do you have for us to present? Are we going to have a player audience for a day, for any time up to 8 hours? The conventions, we do historical conventions. We do conventions that emphasize role play, science fiction conventions. When I first came to NSDM, we did a lot of the 8-hour games, often with a break in the middle. As we looked at the convention audience, trying to manage their schedule, we realized that an 8-hour game would take up a convention goer's entire day. And except for the true NSDM fanatics, we were losing potential audience members. Since we started trying to be flexible, and we would do 2-hour games, 4-hour games, 6-hour games, and then try and fit them into the schedule of the convention so that we would have the appeal to the broadest number of players possible. As to customers, Merle's mentioned before about how NSDM has relied a lot upon word of mouth. For the most part, NSDM players that are experienced will work with new players walking them through, this is how it actually works. You've had the in-brief from the staff, the facilitators, when you're actually on the game, on the floor, moving around, interacting with other players. These are the things you do. These are the things you avoid. And these are things I've done in the past that I'll tell you about now, because you probably won't beat me, but you'll have more fun and you'll get to be a better player. And it's more fun to play against people who are good than to be the one winner in a game full of newbies who haven't figured it out yet because nobody bothered to tell them. Next.
I'll foot stomp one last thing, and that is, when we've done educational events, we'll provide read-aheads and reading lists and subjects and try to work with them ahead of time. We actually had pre-briefs for the Campbellsville University event that we ran, where we had a day of high schoolers and a day of college students. So they had information ahead of time so that we could spend less time on briefing and more time on playing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also good. Preparing that material is also very useful to help bring the NSDM staff up to speed for presenting that particular game and scenario. Because from the staff point of view, we don't always know exactly what we're going to find when we get into the game as well. And so for an academic game, for a government agency game, we want to up our game as facilitators, be deeper aware of what's going on, because we're trying to present a more focused product for the playing audience. And that brings us to the point Merle was stomping out earlier, that a lot of what makes NSDM work is the staff experience. The experience that individual staff members bring from their work, from their educational background, from their professional training, military service, government service. And then we try and draw on those resources as much as possible, both in the design of the scenario and in the management of the game as it's taking place. Again, going back to the emphasis upon, we try and let the players play within the context that we've laid out for them. We don't try and dictate outcomes. We try and show them that the game is going to show you the consequences of your decisions, actions, and your interactions with the other players. We don't write the end of the game for you before we present the game to you. Next.
Okay. Back to me. Can you hear me? Am I working this time? Good. All right. Yeah, this is, I'm going to discuss briefly what the history of NSDM is. Next slide, please. We started out in 1990, as I mentioned before, my brother and I going down to Dragoncon Origins in 1990. And it was the core of the game was supposed to be a seminar, two nation cells with individuals each having their own agenda, discussing how their policies and budget are going to be moved in that nation. We had a stylized map, polar projection with Axis and Allies rules. In your budget, you could procure this number of this type of unit, and you put it on, and we fought through across the world using Axis and Allies rules. The mechanic behind it was just something for people to talk about. The core of the game was supposed to be the U.S. cell and the Soviet cell. In 1990, there was a Soviet Union, and there was a Soviet cell, and that was contemporary, discussing how they were going to, what units they needed to procure and how they're going to move them. The fact that there was a background military mechanic was just a tool that was used in order to focus their discussion. We continued through following Orange to Baltimore and then Milwaukee. Was part of Gen Con. My brother Dan took a year off in the Persian Gulf in 1991 with about 600,000 other Americans. And came back to start to pick up the model again. So it was a simple mechanic. It was strictly contemporary. Through the 1990 to 1995, we added cells, added more venues to it. We went to Gen Con when Gen Con was hosting Origins, but continued to go to Gen Con. We were brought in Dragoncon first time, and they seemed to enjoy us, and they continue to seem to enjoy us. We worked more on the policy and budget sheets. The policy and budget, or P&B, was the nation cells move essentially, and the structure was that every nation in play worked on their policy and budget, and everybody pulled and pushed in the different factions in different directions, moved the policy and budget, and then we went into play. By the mid 1990s, we were more of a free-form mechanic when policy and budget was being worked by one group of people in the background while there was a constant stream of events happening worldwide. We would tailor that. We would say, okay, it's time to slow things down. Let the people work in their P&Bs. Let the people have the different cells have a national election, and then we start injecting things again. We started to put together a permanent staff in that. Up to that point, it was the Mark and Dan show with a handful of veterans we'd pull out of the audience. But we started at that point negotiating conventions to get convention rooms and transport for a set staff of people to come in and help us full time at the conventions. Going into the late 1990s, we retained our U.S.-centric focus. We didn't until about 1998 run a game that didn't have the United States in as the player cell. After one point, we just didn't have enough players in one of our games to put together a USL, so we had to have a game without a USL. But we at that point started to put together our web page, get some web coverage, and put together more and more military control, military action to make things more authentic. We started to make big posters. At that late 1990s, we started to have a problem with convention incompetence. One convention after another would leave us out of the playbook, would tell people that would print up 3 tickets and then tell people we were sold out when we could put 120 people in a game if we wanted to. Our veteran players knew that if they showed up by a ticket and they would say we're sold out, they could show up anyway. They knew, but we needed to advertise. There was one. I remember one Origins 1999. The day before the convention started, we were sitting around our hotel room discussing what we're going to do the next day, and I said, I don't know how we're going to get anybody at all because nobody knows we're here. We're not in the game book. We're not in any listings. Nobody knows that NSDM is here. That's when we made one of our first big posters, printed out on a inkjet printer about 12 different letter size and pasted them all together on a foam board and put it up. Right now, you go to a convention, see people with posters up all over the place advertising their events. We're people who started it out of necessity because nobody knows how to categorize us in these game conventions. They know what a LARP is, they know what an RPG is, they don't necessarily know what a seminar game is. And we didn't fit it neatly into their categories. And I could tell sometimes we were set off to the side by whoever was putting together the game book, trying to figure out where to put us, and they never got back to us. So sometimes we actually word of mouth only went so far, but trying to continue by about 1999 into the early 2000s to get word out that we're here. Please come, show up, and have a good time was becoming more and more difficult. At that point, we try to increase our economic model. One of the ways that a nation cell knows that they're winning the game is if their GDP, gross domestic product, is rising. And we put together a nice spreadsheet that really rewarded players for what we wanted to see them do, which is make trade deals. You go out into the international community, trade what they have in abundance for what they need, what will improve their economy. And additionally, we wanted to keep the chaos level down. A lot of dissensions, a lot of very violent riots would tend to depress that, give their tax structure under control, and we got pretty good at that as things went on. Next slide, please. Now, we initially started out, as I said, with a map and paper units using Axis and Allies rules. Freeform, now we're putting up a real map of the world, and we're putting post-it markers on for the different units. We put together a foam core. It was taking me literally half the convention to get the hundreds of units up on a fold-out map that we set up. But when we started doing foam core, I could be up and running in about 5 minutes. At that point in about 2001, we started the first round of fast play. We initially called them demo games. A lot of players, up until that point, every game we ran was 8 or 10 hours. A couple of 10-hour games, most were 8-hour games. And our standard convention was an 8-hour game Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, with lectures in between. But first thing I wanted to try doing is a demo game, one or more 4-hour games that people would come to and see if they wanted to try the 8-hour games. And a lot of player suggestions were that it's difficult for somebody to go to a convention and commit 8 hours to our game. And that was right. So Merle took on at that point putting together the initial fast play games as a means of trying to capture the same flavor and operations of the full 8-hour game in a 4-hour period. We started to introduce gigabucks, and $1 billion. It was actually 100 tons of gold was actually the standard, because I didn't want to have to redo everybody's budget every year as everybody's GDP went up. But if you peg everything to a certain weight of gold, everybody's spending remains about the same. But one of the troubles that we were having is that up to that point in everybody's budget sheet, Iran was dealing with 100% of their budget, and the U.S. is dealing with 100% of the budget, and they didn't match, because 1% of Iran's budget is not 1% of the U.S. budget. We actually had a couple of games where a player figured this out, and he was able to make money by taking 1% of the U.S. the Iranian budget, transferring it to 1% of the American budget, and then shifting it back, and making money just on the game the game weakness there. But we needed some means for the different nations to be able to have a basic unit of currency so they can streamline their trade. And we introduced the gigabuck into that, which we still find use of. We also started to influence. We're still experimenting after 20 years with influence markers, because a certain degree of influence in Iran might, in theory, be converted to a certain degree of influence in the U.S. might, in theory, be converted to a certain degree of influence in China. And it's a different thing that can be used and traded. At that point, also, we started our Cold War variant, the 1960s. We didn't want, or we said we didn't want to try to make a historical game, because we have to teach all the players what the history is, and then we have to get the entire staff up to speed on it. So we decided we weren't going to make an historical game. It was all going to be contemporary. And then my brother called me up and said, "Oh, yes, we're going to the convention. We're going to be doing a Cold War game. So we're going to start from scratch. In a few months, so we've got to make a whole new game." So we put together our Cold War 1960s variant. The initial focal point was going to be around the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it wasn't going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. We tell people it's the history as it exists, but don't expect we're going to be doing this kabuki dance and following through and doing exactly what they did. Because in the first couple of times we tried this, we had a bunch of U.S. players stare at Cuba and wait and wait and wait and wait, and nothing happened. The missiles never appeared, because it's the world as you know it's starting today. And we often made the point by blowing up John Glenn on the pad in 1961 to say, okay, the future diverges now, and we're not an alternate reality, and we want to keep it reasonable, but things that might have happened, where it might easily happen in our game, things that are unlikely to happen but did happen in real life, but were unlikely are likely to happen in our game. And we're moving on from that into the 1960s, where we started out with U.S. Soviet with ability to do China and Israel, and we now also have United Kingdom and Cuba cells added to that. By 2005, Merle started to expand on the fast play rules to make it our staple game rather than just a demo game, and with new cards and trying to converge the legacy 8-hour game with the 4-hour game, so we could take the same set of player cells and go in either direction. We also began our Crisis game series, or a 2-hour Crisis game series, with I call it the Secession Crisis, so let's list it here as the Civil War game. The plot is that Abraham Lincoln has been elected, and a number of months until he is inaugurated, and we hand out seven, was it seven, Robert? 7 different positions of people in the U.S. body politic to see if they can avoid secession and civil war. And I don't think they ever did they?
No, one of the key problems with that is, we learned this along the way, was one of the issues was slaves were property and slaves were capital. So, one of the proposals the players made was to buy all the slaves from the southern slave owners and free them. And we figured out there was not enough currency in the country to even do that. So that was, they explored some alternatives that might not have been historically accurate, and we looked at what was possible and not. And everybody learned a lot out of it. It was more an educational experiment than it was a real game, because we didn't have a bona fide winner.
Well, but that's a game. That's a legitimate game. But also we had the other extreme. We were generally gauging the game towards an outbreak of fighting around the time of the Battle of First Manassas in the summer And in one game, apparently the South was so determined to have a war that I believe it broke out by January, even before
Yeah.
Lincoln arrived to be inaugurated.
Yeah, and another concern that arose as we were designing that game is that we were going to be having to put agendas and motivations into people's hands
Yeah.
to express and fight for some what would be considered today outrageously racist positions.
Mm-hmm.
And we put it together a disclaimer slide at the beginning saying this is an academic exercise. We request you understand, don't take offense, and we'll try to talk some of these things through. But if we're going to be modeling the body politic at that point, we had to put those positions in, or else it wouldn't be realistic.
And that was one game in which we put together a lot of documentation to support that point, Mark. We really had it like 2 or 3 notebooks full of original text.
And we run into that problem in other games that we've developed, but not as severely, because we've deliberately decided not to go into the World War II business and talk about gassing Jews and things like that and the kind of atrocities that went on. But we do still struggle with it sometimes. The Cold War games in the U.S., there's a Dixiecrat player. Sometimes we have a lot of fun with it. At Gen Con one year, the only black gentleman that came to play wound up being the Dixiecrats, and he had a tremendous time being as obnoxious as he could. But, you're not always going to get that lucky. So you have to be sensitive to people's concerns and the fact that the moral standing and motivations that may not all be the same. And even in the modern area, we have that problem sometimes with Iran and Cold War China.
Yeah, continuing our crisis game series, we also built I call it the Games of August, but World War I crisis. Can the players, the European great powers, avoid the First World War? Moving on into the 2007, 2008, my brother Dan got sick and couldn't participate anymore, so he checked out of the pattern. And he survived in a home for about 8 more years, but unfortunately he's gone now. But we continue to improve our Cold War game, run additional improvements to Israel, China, France, Turkey. 2010 was one of our biggest years ever. We had a game at the National Defense University. Some of their people had come and played one of our games at a civilian convention, and they were astonished as government gamers as to how we did dynamic gaming, as to how we moved, allowed the game to move however the players wanted to. Their natural instinct would be to, if the players are going left when they expect them to go right, is to drag them by the collar and make them go the other way. Marine Corps intelligence activity brought us in a couple of times as a capstone for a game for a leadership training event. We'll continue to work on policy and budget sheets. One trouble is, and it takes a lot of time, and as we're cutting our games down to 4 hours more typically, it ends up being boring. So we're still finding it out, trying to work our way around what policy and budget sheet ought to be like, and how we ought to make it work. Robert?
Yeah, I think the other issue we run into on the economic side is that the economic cycles for the macro level decisions that we're making, the economic cycles that get you to the consequences of different budgetary decisions on this scale often go beyond the length of the game.
Well, they definitely in the United States go beyond the length of an administration, and maybe 2, because it takes 10 plus years from the time you start construction to field an aircraft carrier. There are lots of programs that take a long time, so we really have abused time and space in order to see that the players get to see the consequences of that, but we also try to weigh it against other things they're going to lose.
Mm-hmm. Next slide.
We're there.
Van?
A lot of people do not realize that with the COVID vaccinations, the Pfizer and Moderna one specifically, the part of the vaccine that carries it, what they call the new material, is actually 20 years in development. It was only getting the listing for the actual virus itself that took these last about 12 months.
Okay. About 2010, we're still at this point. We're still hauling around the foam boards and opening them up to create the military map. And when there's an inject to be made, we are still sticking our head into the room and screaming into the room and interrupting everything. About 2010, we started to work with more online tools. Our map tools was created, which is a network map that we can drag units around on the map. From one workstation, they move on every other display in every cell. Plus a news feed, which is essentially a modified chat, in which we can inject the news, inject events, with the added capability that we can mark them with what the news source is. So if it's Al Jazeera, you can take the news in one direction. If it's CNN, you can take the news in another. How much weight you're going to put in, how accurate it's going to be, and realize that the DPRK news is going to put a different spin on something than Reuters is going to. We continue with our crisis game development series with our Cuban Missile Crisis game, and this is actually 3 games. We have a Havana game, we call it Havana Paranoia, Moscow Megalomania, and Washington Wobblies. And these can be run as 3 different games with a modest cell of up to 12 people and two staff members with 1 person in IT supporting. And so we can do that pretty quickly and easily, or we can combine them with an overarching game control group to make the cells coordinate the cells together. And we've had a lot of fun with that, and they've had a lot of legs. We've run it professionally at Fort Benning. We had to give that game in Spanish. That was intriguing. And it was what we were in a best position online last year when everything was shut down for the COVID pandemic, to run the Cuban Missile Crisis game several times online. We started also doing more individual crisis games, a sculpted scenario with injects, and let the players go through a certain scenario in 2 hours. And our Doomsday game, which we've described as the barroom brawl with WMD, and that's usually read at midnight when players are feeling frisky and they just want to get something out of their system. It's not part. We don't consider it to be part of our core routine, but it is a lot of fun. We've been adding cells in the 2015, 2018, adding UK and Cuba into our Cold War 1960s game. We redesigned the Chinese cell. The Chinese cell up to that point had been a modification of the original Soviet cell we ran in 1990 with a Soviet cell, of course, the KGB, the Red Army, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Chinese cell was the Communist Party of China with the People's Liberation Army and the Ministry for State Security. The mechanics exactly the same, and it was essentially up to that point an 800-pound third world country in the middle of the whole cell. But the redesign in 2016 was to turn new China into a peer competitor for the U.S. and allow China to be operating worldwide in a manner that the U.S. is going to be finding very challenging to keep up with. It essentially empowered every player in the Chinese cell to go out and do something internationally. And usually, by the time the U.S. Secretary of State or an ambassador goes to some third world country to try to negotiate an infrastructure deal, there's been 1 or 2 Chinese players already there who are digging in like a tick. And we've had a little bit of fun. It's worthy of redesign now again, but it was a necessary step, recognizing that we're moving into a bipolar world again. And the last couple of years, we've started putting together a 1980s Cold War cell for the USSR. We would have put together a US cell 1980s last year if everything wasn't shut down for the pandemic. We ran a game, as I mentioned, in Spanish for the Western Hemisphere International Security and Cooperation class, essentially a capstone game, our Cuban Missile Crisis game at Fort Benning, Georgia. And we ran a couple of games at Campbellsville University, one for high school history students. And the teachers loved us. They were a bit skeptical at first when they saw how active these students were getting into issues that they were beginning to understand in a way that another venue was not likely to have introduced them to. And then we moved on. That was on Friday, and on Saturday we had the actual game for the college students themselves, which also went very well. Last year we moved into the Discord server to run a couple of Cuban Missile Crisis games, as I mentioned, at a few venues, and we gave a series of lectures both at Gen Con and Dragoncon, which you can find on our YouTube channel as well. And we're looking also into a new European Union megacell as a more of a multipolar world with the U.S., China, European Union, and some form of Russia in the future. Next slide.
So we had a question.
Go ahead. Yes.
And the question was, could this game type be used to prepare PMC or SIT for cell members for CPX in a large, complex, multinational scenario? And I'll start that one. The answer is yes, but it'll take an incredible amount of work. Anybody else want to add to that? Every nation cell that we create is with an expert designer that's already read the background material and knows it well, a 120-hour project. Yeah. Just to give you a sense, when we redesign a country cell from scratch, you basically have 40 hours of work roughly. That's the analysis of who's important and how important are they, and looking into voting strengths in legislatures and what non-governmental entities are important. And then you spend another 40 hours figuring out which of those need to be players and how you describe very pithily and briefly what they're all about. And then the last 40 hours is doing the artwork to set up our card decks, and you'll see examples of those in a little bit. Also, if you want to see what we did with the Discord server, there's a 10 or 15 minute pitch about that in our distributed gaming presentation that was done on the first day of Connections, and that's already out on YouTube. So now we'll hit the next slide.
Okay. This is for some of the early, before we went to our online tools for military maps. These are what we were using when we could, again, set these up in a matter of minutes because we just have to fold them up and pack them away neatly, and then I'll fold them again. The polar map, I really enjoyed taking a 20-something guy up to this polar map and showing them in the 1960s game just how close the Soviet Union and the United States were to each other. And constantly with B-52, B-58, and Bear bombers on constant patrol, and you can see the little target symbols are their fail-safe points. So when they start to move toward one, you see one side starts to see the other move toward that. They know something's up, and we had a few scenarios with that. And again, a breakout map of Israel surrounded by people who aren't necessarily friendly to Israel, and then of course showing somebody how the preponderance of forces in Europe during the Cold War, where yes, the West is going to have a sizable air advantage and the East is going to have a sizable ground advantage, and that's the way it's going to be. Down at the bottom there, you can see in the Greece area, I put these are post-its, standard post-its. I printed them up, and you got to do some Kentucky windage when you try to decide on a color scheme, because if something looks red on your screen but then you print it on orange post-it, it's not going to look red anymore. So you have to figure. I did have to do a lot of trial by error and get the thing just right. But down at the bottom, I have standard labels that I put on a set of standard post-its of different colors, and I could put together a set. If somebody says that they want to invade Bazookistan, I haven't made a military marker set for every country in the world, but I can look up, and I had a spreadsheet. I could look up what the armed forces of Bazookistan amounts to in terms of armored vehicles and army and aircraft and ships, and I can punch that into an Excel spreadsheet, and it tells me how many mechanized brigades to make and how many infantry brigades to make, and then how many attack aircraft, and then how many bombers and transport aircraft and attack helos. It gives me the entire order of battle based on a handful of numbers that I enter. And I can have that cell up and running in about 10 minutes from the time that somebody says, I want to invade Bazookistan, before they decide how they want to invade Bazookistan. I can show them what the Bazookistan order of battle is. Next slide. Okay, factions, positions. We experiment with what the factions positions are. What are the voting strengths? An individual legislator number 1 might have 23 votes, and legislator 2 might have 28 votes. We've experimented with that. Often it was a way early in the game to tell somebody who was winning and who was losing, you better get your act together because you just lost voting strength. I didn't like that too much. It was usually unusual, I found, when you had 5 players in the legislature for the voting strength to be such that 3 did not always outvote 2. And if that in fact happened that 2 could outvote 3, then usually you got a problem because those 3 are being marginalized in some way or another. But we've been experimenting with that, trying to give someone a feel for what the relative strengths of the different factions that are represented in the nation's body politic are. If somebody doesn't have a whole lot of votes, we usually try to give him some other power or some other position to make the game interesting for him. I don't like giving a player a card at the start of the game saying, "Congratulations, thank you for coming, you just lost." Because you drew this card at the very start and that's your position, but we expect you to stick around for the next 7 hours and get beaten up.
Yeah, a key point there is we used to have Terrorist 1 and Terrorist 2 about 2001. And when you'd hand out Terrorist 2, everybody knew there was going to be a Terrorist 1. And they'd all go, ooh.
Yeah, that was funny. The first time we had a Middle East cell and we had a Terrorist number 2 and everybody joked, there are 2? Yeah, there are 2. Now, Terrorist number 2 was international. He was more of an Al-Qaeda type. Terrorist number 1 was local, regional. He was more of a Hamas. So there were 2 different people, and they had 2 different agendas and 2 different sets of things they were going to do. But they just found that as really funny. But next slide. Gigabucks I mentioned are about $1 billion US. It's actually a bit. It would actually be. Well, never mind. Now this is so that the different nations can, in fact, trade with each other. And when somebody wants to say, "I want to build this carrier, what's it going to cost?" I could pretty quickly come up with some idea of what it's going to cost on a crude level. So anyway, remember, even if you get a slice of the deal, your margin is a small fraction of those amounts. Okay. Now we've also been experimenting with color tokens. You see the chips down here, various forms of influence. You have this chip, it means something. This other chip means other things. They might mean things. They don't even easily transfer between cells, but within your cell, it can get you something. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Merle, I think this is probably better for you than me. So anyway, okay.
This is a new attempt at play aids. One of the things we started doing because we got a little more bandwidth was to try to give some visual aids to the players during the game, things that would make things simple, because in the old days, stuff was black and white printed, and at one point we were handing out 17 and 18 pages of PowerPoint slides, and that was just horrible. And then we moved to a very efficient way of briefing, where our old briefings ran very long. Now we can brief the game in 15 minutes. So what we also did was try to give them the mechanics of how their internal operations in their country worked and a little bit of background. So this is something that we developed and did not get to do for all of our country cells, but we have done for several and are trying to roll out more of it, that talks about the relationship and the powers involved, because you can't put everything a player needs on a postcard, because our standard thing, and you'll see an example soon, is that players get postcards that are back and front printed with a public and a private side. And that's our fast way of getting people stood up. Very rarely now do we use more than one postcard for a player to give them background, but it used to be they get a whole narrative sheet that might be a page long that would say, you know, you're the GRU and this is what the GRU does, and how they're figured into military intelligence in the Soviet Union, and, you know, oh, you're the Department of State, and these are all the fingers you have in everything from foreign military sales to, you know, negotiations between countries and how you do the UN. You can't encapsulate the world on a set of pages that are something they can read in a 4 or even an 8-hour game. So we started coming up with these visual aids. The other thing that we wind up doing in the game, which isn't reflected in any of the pictures, is our facilitators do education. So if somebody says, I want to move the entire Marine Corps to Lebanon, they're going to talk to the military controller, and Mark's going to say, wait a minute, there are Marines in out in Japan, there are Marines, in the north, like they do maneuvers in Norway, so maybe they're on maneuvers. It takes you months to get all those guys in one place. That you can't put on a card because you don't know what question the player's going to ask. So that's where the profound knowledge and the research, where we've had people with years and years of background, can make that happen. And the quality of our games are impacted by which staff can go to which conventions. If we're going to run a primarily international and diplomatic game, I want Robert at that game if it's at all possible, because he's retired from the State Department. He knows what a political démarche is, and half the staff can't describe what a political démarche is. Okay. When it comes to military, there are a few of us that can talk about the logistics and time, but Mark's the best guy for that. So if Mark's not there, we do things to compensate. So this is just how we've tried to move it forward and make it easier and easier for the players. But every decision, whether it's on a design piece or a play aid, is another piece of our bandwidth, because it's all volunteer. There are only a few of us that are so heavily infected that we do a lot of this. So we talked earlier about this. I'll let Mark pick up.
Okay, this is currently where we stand as far as our technology. I mentioned how we were using the foam board military marker sets, and we were going to our map tool system. We see on the left here is our map tools showing the U.S., and on the right is our news feed. And this is, in fact, a capture from a crisis game we ran about a mega asteroid that actually calved and dropped a whole bunch of different asteroids in different places around the planet. So everyone had to deal not only with trying to stop the asteroids, which they couldn't do, possibly they couldn't stop everyone, but also consequence management, getting ready for the impacts, and then dealing with the aftermath of both the refugees, salvage, and environmental consequences. We see in the U.S. cell in the middle, we see an asteroid, actually the impact zone in the middle of the U.S. The news feed talks about an asteroid hit landing in the Yukon and what the consequences are. Now, I can move any of the, my computer as military controller, I can move any of these markers, and it will be shown on 4 or 5 different projections around the game. So it's in each cell, each room. And anyone can inject, well, a number of people. There are stations we can inject news into this news feed, so keeping things flowing, and people aren't disturbed by us yelling news injects in. They could actually read, and they could scroll back through to get the last sets of news. Next slide. This is a capture from the Cuban Missile Crisis game. The range rings are the range of various anti-aircraft pieces, and you can see that we're well into the game with a nuclear torpedo having gone off around the Bermuda Islands, and radiation downstream. And that's just where we are. We completely different campaign we have to start up, but use the same techniques. Next slide. Player aids. We used to, when we started out, give every player a half page to 1 page describing who he was in detail, and let him figure out what he wants to do in the game. With an 8-hour game, that's okay. He can read that, he can digest it, he can figure out where he's going to go. I want to say, I think that we're losing some of our attention span as a culture, so people aren't willing to do that anymore. Plus, in a 4-hour game in which we usually have a 45-minute in-brief and a 45-minute out-brief and 2.5 hours player time, we need to give somebody something much more abbreviated. We find that today's generation responds much more quickly and easily to bulletized lists. So we'll give this, and this is printed on a standard postcard stock. So we can, they cost a few cents each, so we can spend 10, 20, 30 bucks at every convention with just making consumables. The player can keep it as a souvenir if he wants to, or he can discard it at the end. We've had a lot of players go, "Do you want this?" I said, "Do you know how much trouble it would be to try to accumulate every single one and put it back together? Just throw it away or keep it."
The other part of this is none of the information we put on the cards is really secret. The motivations are not well known that are on the back, but this particular sample is a demo card. We've only had it played once in a game when we had a youngster come along with their parent, but it's a way for you to see. The front shows all these sign, symbols, and tokens of a nation, and the back is the stuff that you should share with somebody at your peril, because if they know what motivates you, they'll know how to mess with you. So back to Mark.
Yeah, the front you see here is what everybody sees and knows about you. The back is your own, for your own, and what you share is up to you. We also do warn people that if you're wearing a tag that says you're terrorist #2, you should take it off before you go to the airport, or else allow extra time. Next slide. And this is what the back would be. And this is, again, something known to you that you may or may not would choose to share. But it could say, yes, you killed JFK, keep this to yourself. We've done that to a few players once in a while. So this is essentially your motivation, your agenda, what you want to achieve that someone else might be able to figure out just by virtue of who you are, but not necessarily. You got a few secrets to keep to yourself. Also, it tells you what your special powers are. Not X-ray vision, but in terms of, yes, you can influence the legislature. You have control of these military units, and you run these mines and this kind of thing.
I have to add one more thing to this. We learned lessons about communication, and the one that just I still get so much humor out of is on some of these we put, you have the power of persuasion. And we had D&D players come in and say, how do I implement the power of persuasion? I'm going to cast a spell. It's just hilarious because, we're trying to give them a starter. We can't give them everything that this group is about. And, it's not rocket science.
I mean, the aforementioned stuffed monkey had the power of interrogation. Anyway, go ahead. Next slide.
There we go.
This is an example of policy and budget sheet. The way it used to run, the way it will run in the future. And we tell you what the gross domestic product is. That'll be in gigabucks. What move it is, and overall spending, and both as a percentage and as a total points in terms of gigabucks. The other is military spend. That's the budget sheet. The others in percentage are orientation or policy, and shifting it in one direction or another might be on your agenda. Might also be something that the nation that's called for by events. We want to move it this way or that way. This is for our Cold War game, moving from Yeltsinian Westernization to Stalinistic oppression, for example. I see this mark for you, Merle. Any other comments on it?
The big thing to point out here is this is the original format of PMBs, and PMBs have evolved a lot over time. This one has some challenges for a lot of younger players because they don't know what Yeltsinian or Gorbachevian means. So you wind up having to do explanations. So we found that doing stuff with the math of domestic product and so on was complex. And we started trying to play with different things. So we found out you can actually use this for fantasy concepts. And this is one of our favorites because you can put money into the all-seeing eye or official bribes. And then we started trying to be a lot more technical. And we played with this, and it has its own problems. Here we've got public information we pulled, like GDP and parity assessments, tax rates that are guesses. But the thing here is, essentially what we're trying to get across to the players is there's where money comes from, there's where money goes to, there's the things that happen in your society for all kinds of other reasons that are important, because a high corruption society is a real issue. If you're in India, there were like a third of the legislators at least are under criminal indictment almost all the time. That's a big issue. And then there's all this stuff down here, which is policy and what you're going to do in implementation. So we sort of tried to merge the old and the new here, and it still breaks down because we don't have the time for the players to do it in a power-hour game. So what we keep emphasizing with all of this is the staff expertise is what helps make it run. Our staff is the player staff. We don't expect them to know everything. They don't have to be a military officer to play a military commander or the Joint Chiefs of Staff in our game. Our staff will give you the kind of answers they would expect that your staff would give you. So if you're out of Baluchistan, the odds of you knowing what the U.S. arsenal is, other than a lot, is pretty slim. But the staff is not there to play against you. So we really try to set a point that we're trying to be as reasonable as we can and give you options instead of roadblocks. And the real key in our games is that it works like the real world. Basically, you have to have an idea, which creates a plan, and then you have to have the what, why, where, how type stuff. Whether you're going to do anything, you need resources. It may just be yours, it may be your friends. And one of the ways we manage that in our games is with special cards. The key one is this action card that you see on the left, because essentially there are a couple of versions of it, but we ask the players to write on the back and say, what is it you want to do? I want to build an interstate highway system. And then we say, okay, to do that, you need this much money, or politically, because we don't use coins or units of currency most of the time, you need 3 of the 5 senators in the game to sign off and 4 of the 7 people in the House of Representatives, and you have to hope the president doesn't veto it. That may be the mechanic we give them, and we try to make that reasonable based on the way we've staffed, because in a 52-person U.S. cell, yes, we can go that high, it's going to be a lot more people. But we don't want to make it unachievable. So that's a compromise we have to deal with, and that's where our staff expertise kicks in. But it's basically, what is it I want to do? How many people do I need to get on board to do it? And we'll aim them at people that we think are most likely to support them, because we want the game to move forward. Okay. It also is a great tool because it ensures in the fast-paced world of our games that, number one, they get a clear decision on anything they do on a form. They can get a question, a background, an interpretation of something from a staffer, but if they want it to drive play in the game, it needs to be on an action sheet. And we've got harsher and harsher about that because it's the way to be sure that they get the answer. And here's an example. I want to build a Death Star. I want to crush the rebellion. I want to build it on the moons of Endor, and I'm going to use engineers and secret taxes and everything else, and the result may be just like the movie. The Rebel Alliance destroyed the Death Star. What do you want to try next? It's okay. So the reason we use a lot of the big budget stuff so rarely is they take a lot of time and pigeonhole a handful of players that make strategic decisions for the whole group. We haven't figured out how to solve that. We keep experimenting, and we use different models. We got another one we're kicking around now, but it isolates players from the flow of the game. Their decisions don't count when you do it that way. So we also struggle to understand how it really works. Does anybody think economists really fully understand how the world economy works? I think the answer is no. So what we've done in practice is say 80 or 90% of your budget is fixed, because most of those things don't vary that much, and we give the players discretionary funds. So they can do 1 or 2 big projects per nation, and they can do 3 or 4 little ones. And if they go beyond that, we say, you've just done X. What are you going to pay for it with? Are you going to raise taxes? Are you going to trade something else, etc.? So the other things we run up against, because we work in public venues, and this happens in professional venues just as well, is you have issues with sharks and wackos, dominant personalities that affect the fun. So some of the things we do to adjust for that are sometimes we'll actually promote somebody. We'll make them a facilitator for a particular task. Your job is to handle all these action sheets and help us out. Oh, it's so great you're doing that. Thank you so much. And gee, they're not pushing everybody around anymore. Sometimes we'll deal from the bottom of the deck. If we know somebody's come to a convention and they always play a certain way, we'll give them a position that won't disrupt play, where they can have fun. But the big thing to keep in mind is you got to watch them, because sometimes people will try to monopolize the staff and get FaceTime for the win. If I talk to you the most, you're going to talk that I'm best at the end, or they'll prevent somebody else from doing something. And we also are pretty sensitive. We've dealt with a lot of challenged people for hearing, mobility, and age issues, younger people, and we accommodate that pretty well, I think. But sometimes we get people who are high and drunk and overtired, and that also means we have dropouts in the middle of the game. We had a game in Atlanta where we had 5 people that were all in the same group, and they left at one time because one of their group members was high and collapsed. So we had to recast and deal with that. The other key thing is documenting actions so we can ensure adjudication. So we emphasize for the staff to circulate and observe what's going on and report to the game director or one of our senior staff when they see an issue. The other thing is organizing all the pieces to make this happen. I mean, basically right now we've got 6 people I call beyond all hope that put in lots of time. We've got about 12 hardcore volunteers that'll show up at least at 1 or 2 conventions a year to help facilitate or control cells. And we've had at least 40 different people who have volunteered to help at different points. Right now, the people I'd say are sort of the whole group is a little in the mid-20s. And we have to do all the convention planning and deal with all the logistics because we take projection screens, computers, handouts, painter's tape, wall hangings, all kinds of stuff to make it happen. But the biggest single challenge is it's all self-funded. And the people that aren't retired like myself have day jobs, so we have to take into account that they have limited leave. What that means is we normally do 3 engagements a year at conventions, and we've done a maximum of 7. And as people get a little older and retire, they're either going to get sick or they're going to have a lot more time to add. So we have that challenge like everybody else. And the question always is, are you guys a club or a professional body? And the answer is yes, because we've traditionally been sort of a glorified club, but we've had a core group that's been around for a long time. And once in the past we were incorporated, found out it didn't do us any good, and we stopped. And now we just recently reincorporated. So some of the things we do are club and some of the things we do are corporation. But the reason for the corporation is that we're being asked to sign contracts for doing work at conventions. We sometimes have academic venues, and there was discussion with the University of Georgia to run a summer camp this year, which sort of fell through because they don't want to run as many classes as they planned. But that's why we started to do that. But somehow, despite all of those challenges, we've got a brand because we sit in between the professionals and the amateurs because we do amateur stuff in a professional way and professional stuff in a professional way. And that has gotten unusual attention. The disadvantage to the whole process is there's no money. Okay, there's long hours, but you get noticed. The advantage is you get a reputation. Basically, where we are right now, we have 23 nations we've modeled in the modern world, 7 of which are good for play because things are close enough to reality. We've got 7 Cold War countries in the 60s, 1 Cold War country in the 80s, and 5 experiments, which includes the Cuban Missile Crisis game, because they're not like our regular games. The challenge always is that modern cells become outdated because leaders, parties, changes, and processes do. But our goal is that we learn from each one, and we try to strive for ground truth in modeling what we do. So our projects right now is we've started a YouTube channel. We're doing a lot of web broadcasts from the conventions that way. We're working on a new web page. We're working on a new Israeli cell. We're working on more 80s Cold War stuff. We're looking at a Suez Crisis game, still fighting with PMB prototypes and academic marketing. And we're going through all the stuff for corporate existence, because every layer you peel back, you find out there's rules on soliciting for donations, and there's rules about being a licensed solicitor. And then for some classes, if you wanted to teach, you have to have a teaching license. We're dealing with that. Right now, we can take donations, but we shouldn't solicit, because if we ask you for money, then we have different requirements and they change by state. We're working on that. But, if you really want to contribute, provide labor. And that's the real point of what we're doing here. We wanted to give people who never heard anything about NSDM a feel for how we work. And we struggled to explain it because we are so different. But we will always would like volunteers, because you get all kinds of benefits. You get no pay, you get long hours, you get weird venues, you get challenging research, and get to hang with a bunch of really weird people. So you guys want to add anything to that?
I think that about sums it up.
Any more questions from the audience? We'll give you one more shot. Okay, well, it's really strange. We made it to exactly when we had planned to end. So we want to thank you all for joining us, and we'll continue to answer questions in the chat. If you want to get a hold of us, you can message me on the Discord server or pick on us with a private message on our Facebook page, and we will catch you all at another time. Thank you so much.